Tevis is where it all began. That's what started endurance riding. It's what kicked the whole idea off, and worldwide it is known as the greatest accomplishment in endurance riding.
It's just special to be able to ask your horse to do that and ask your body to do that. It was wonderful, and you know, even though right now I'm pretty sore and say, oh, I don't ever want to do that again, I'm sure in a few days I'm gonna say, you know what, that was neat, and I do want to do that journey again.
I've told people for years that Tevis was like a drug, and that it's one of those events that once you do it, you either are totally hooked or you'll never touch it again. I would consider the Tevis Olympic quality. I've always said that, and I've said that at the board meetings frequently when I, as a board member for Western States, said this is the gold standard, this is the gold medal of endurance riding, and we have to make sure that we maintain the integrity of the ride and that we keep it as the gold standard.
When I see or hear the word Tevis, I mean, the first thing what I think about is this collage of elements at once. I mean, that's what it means to me. It's high altitude and crossing snow caps, and then getting dusted in the moon dust of alpine trails, and then having that dust burnt into you by the sun, all on the same day. You know, and that's what I appreciate about it, is that test that, you know, you're going to come here and you're going to pass through several different ecologies and environments and have many different kinds of footings and tests. And this is the way you measure a horse, because their ancestors, even before we domesticated them, lived or died by their ability to cross long distances. And you don't cross long distances on this earth without feeling out several different types of terrain. And that's why this is such an important course, because this is how you define a horse, is not by just testing them on one terrain and one flat footing, but to show them several different types of nature. And then you'll produce the animal that their ancestors meant to be. First attempt here would have been like 86. I didn't complete that year. I got as far as Forest Hill. My horse got a little stone bruise coming up out of the canyon. And he was off for just a matter of hours, but the wrong couple of hours. And he was better than that evening, you know. Yeah, so he got pulled at Forest Hill, and that was the end of my ride in '86. I came back again in I think it was 1990, and finished it then. Well, I didn't get to know Wendell very well. I met him the first year I'd come out here with my family, and friends of the family and my mentors, Matthew McKay Smith. And they introduced me to Wendell briefly, so I made his acquaintance. I was 17 then. And so I remember talking to him a bit, and the little guy with the big booming voice, you know. Yeah. He talked like, when he talked, his small in stature, and when he spoke, you know, it shook you back almost, because he had such a strong voice for a small man, you know. I mean, I can remember him doing the briefings when the first time I came out here. I remember somebody asked him a question during the briefing that they asked if anybody had ever gotten lost on the trail ride, and he said, no. We said, we've never lost anybody, not more than 3 days. My first completion, I came back, like I'd said, in the 90s and rode a Moyle horse stallion. That first time I had visited here in '79, I also met another person that came to be a mentor of mine, Rex Moyle from Idaho, and he was known for raising his own line and genetically unique horses on a rangeland in Idaho. And I was fortunate enough to get one of the only stallions that he ever let leave the ranch. And I brought that stallion as it matured, and I got it ready. I brought it back here and did the Tevis with it. Yeah, a lot happens, you know, and but you expect that. I mean, if you're coming fully prepared mentally, you expect things to not be on a plan. you make a plan and you know you're going to improvise and modify, and the day is going to be a little different than what you figured. And that's part of the test, is that will you be daunted by those change, or will you just accept it as part of nature? And that's part of the beauty of these, of doing this kind of natural test, as opposed to running in a show ring or some other competition. There's nobody else to blame. I mean, you knew nature was nature before you started. And you can't fault nature for being natural, and things happen different. And it's all about being aware and ready for that, and adaptive when things don't go perfectly. Everybody's had a shoe thrown or a horse fall down and get a scrape. I remember the second time, one of the times I came here, my horse slipped early in the ride, and got a good scrape, and it had to be doctored pretty carefully, but he responded well to everything we did and finished the ride beautifully, And that's the kind of things you have to be prepared, to deal with, and not let it get you down and make you throw up your hands and give up. The year when I came here in 2010 with heraldic, I mean, it was like we had horses that were particularly well conditioned for the heat, because I'd been training in the sweltering humidity of the East Coast, for several months before that, and my horses were really well prepared for hot conditions. And it was to my fortune that it turned out to be a pretty darn hot ride, and my horses were able to sort of like run the gauntlet just ahead of the wave, and stay on the crest of it like a boat that can stay on the plane when the ones with 5 horsepower less just can't make it, and they really just sort of bathed in the breeze and their own breeze all day long, and really took off. That year we got into the last vet check, and as I presented my horse, the vet told me, he said, "John, do you realize your 2 horses are 3 hours ahead of the next?" That was a good day. That was a really good day. We got to back off and just have a little celebration the whole last 6 miles. And I wasn't even aware of where the crowd was that day. Matter of fact, what information I had wasn't correct. I thought people were a whole lot closer than that. I wasn't really caring anyway. We were just getting our horses home for dinner. It shows you just how a small difference in fitness and preparation can, in the right condition, can just make a huge difference in time. I don't know. I've been doing this so long, and that's kind of what coming to the Tevis and so particularly the couple of oldest rides we have in the country are about, and why they're so important is because they've had essentially the same course year after year. And so for 40 years, my family and myself have been honing our techniques of training and development. And you come back to these rides not because you're trying to outrun everybody else, because they're the best measure of the rider you were 5 years ago and the rider you were 10 years ago. And you get to, we're all trying to be creative and invent better techniques and patterns of training and conditioning and developing. And this is where you come to test yourself, to prove if the changes you've made lately in your training program are truly the improvement you think they are or not, and that's why it's so important to have some of these classic courses that are wonderful broad spectrum tests, and they stay nearly the same year after year after year. The Tevis is definitely among the most difficult in the world. I've done other quite challenging courses as well, and each one you could say was maybe a little more difficult in this manner or that aspect or that aspect. The Tevis is nice that it rolls lots of different difficulties into one test. And that's why I think it's appreciated so much and valued so much, because it isn't so much about to be a good athlete here and to excel on courses like this. You don't necessarily have to be a superstar at any one aspect of athleticism. It's much more important that you're pretty darn good at everything. And that's actually a much more meaningful evaluation of quality of genetics and soundness. And it's much more beneficial to the horses of the future for us to make those kind of evaluations rather than be so obsessed about what fraction of a second they ran 1 mile, or how they ran some course that was almost completely monogamous, homogeneous all the way through. This is all of the tests of nature put on in one day. And that's what's really important about it. I mean, this has been part of one of the most important things that endurance riding, and particularly this ride, has contributed to equestrian sports in total, and not just endurance riding, because this is the first place where we sort of integrated this concept of veterinary control into the competition and the sport and made it a seamless part of the competition. And that is key to why this works nowadays. We've had jackpot races and long distance horse races around the world for 1,000 years before this, and we knew they were an important way to measure and test the horse. But as modern sensibilities of what was humane treatment came on, we were kind of the most important way we could measure the horse was starting to also get a black eye. And because it's because when you measure horses at the thing that they do the very best, it's very close. It's a sharp edge. And the veterinary control system is what keeps us on the ethical and the useful and side of that edge, to where we can, if we manage this well, we can have a discipline that does benefit to the animal, and particularly does benefit to the species. By helping them, does more good than harm, and that should be the goal. Is to always feel like you're doing more good than harm, that you create more happiness and welfare than you create suffering. And we'll never be perfect. We'll always be. You can't really do the best for them without daring to be a little close to the edge, because you don't measure them for what they're really about unless you dare to be a little close and do your very level best to never step over that edge. And that's what it's about, and that's what the veterinary control system helps us do. That's what it's all about, and it's been honed to a fine art over the last 5 or 6 decades now. Yeah, the tack, like myself, most of the tack that's been developed, and I've contributed a few different little design models and stuff for several, we have to make sure that we're covering general surface area of the back so that our body weight isn't focused in one place. It has to be relatively adaptive, because the horse's back, when he's exercising and running across country, is not a static machine. So you have to have something that disperses the rider's body weight evenly across a fairly generous surface area of the horse's back, and yet is adaptive enough to not put pressure points as he moves. And then at the same time, you're trying to do this without and carry a little bit of extra gear and the things you'll need to be with you on the course during the day. And at the same time, not weigh any more than you absolutely have to, because he doesn't need to carry more. He's already carrying enough for us, and we have to make sure that it doesn't weigh anymore. So those features, aside from the fact that it has to fit you pretty exquisitely. And so we spend a lot of time customizing, and many of the best saddles we have are the ones that can be custom ordered with the right seat shape for the rider and adaptable so that it can fit the horse, and hopefully even be readapted to fit a different horse and another horse. An RP saddle representative come to me asking me, I think on a couple of different occasions, was contacted about why wasn't I using their saddle. They had this wonderful design. It had a nice adaptive, dynamic back, horse surface, and I liked the fundamental design, but it was I have a fairly narrow hip structure, like a lot of males, and it wasn't always comfortable for me to have something that was quite so full down the side. And also, since particularly in that time I was competing in international competition, and it's very critical to not have rider and tack weight much more than 165 pounds. And so I needed a saddle that was a little lighter than any of their current models. And so I worked with them over several prototypes and design changes until we kind of honed out a design that their builders could do and I was comfortable with, and it got the weight down to the range that I could use for those international targets. And that the creation of that heraldic model. I think a lot of riders have been using that RP heraldic model. I think more people than we realized in the beginning actually appreciate having the lack of skirts and everything under your leg, so it fits narrower, and more people than we realized are actually more comfortable in that position long term. And with that RP dynamic and adaptable system, it's been very popular. Heraldic was bred by Asgard Arabians in Sinks Grove, West Virginia. And at the time, their reigning stallion, who produced a lot of really high quality endurance horse, was called Statistic. All of his sons got named with IC endings, and Heraldic was just the name that happened to be in there. And he was originally, it's actually not my horse. He's my father's horse. We were down visiting Asgard Arabians for some other business. Tom Savitz of Asgard was donating a horse to a club that we support, and we were picking the horse up to put some training on it for him. And my father saw this horse as a 2-year-old in the field. He kind of stood out from the 30 or 40 others that he was standing with at the time, running with out there. And so he came home in the trailer with us. And it just happened to be my good fortune that I got to ride him, because my father had an injury just as the horse was coming of age to compete well, and had an injury that took him out of riding for a couple of years, and the horse couldn't wait, so he became mine. And once I had so much success with him, he kind of stayed mine for a while. I've been blessed with a lot of horses, and I could name many of them favorites for different reasons. Heraldic was probably the most gifted athlete in all across the board, particularly as an all-around athlete. He's probably the most gifted I could ever expect to have. He'd won this ride quite handily a couple of times, and set records on courses all over the country, and traveled around the world. And when he was having a good day, he only set a record because the second horse was giving him that much trouble. But he could have done it almost any of his rides, and so he was probably the most outstandingly athletic. I appreciate him, and I like that horse a lot, but he wasn't anybody's pet. He was like an all business machine, didn't really need humans. I was just a necessary inconvenience on the competition as far as that horse was concerned. We got along, and fortunately we both liked getting the same job done. But he was other horses, like when I competed for a while, Ramit, which is the son of that stallion I've completed my first endurance ride on. That was a lot of fun. He was game, and he had, he woke up. You could tell every mile of 100 miles he was exuberant and buoyant, and was communicative, and wanted to know what you wanted to do. What are we doing, boss? What are we doing, boss? Was kind of the feeling you got all day. What next, boss? What next? And that's really the mindset you want to have in every horse. One analogy: there's another tough ride on the East Coast called the Old Dominion that I've been engaged in developing for years. Been helping develop the trails and the coursework and such, and supported that club there. That was near my homeland, and I used to say that the Tevis starts like a lion, but it does end like a lamb. And the Old Dominion was just a nasty bear all the way through. The Tevis has probably a little broader, and this is why I like it so much, it has a little broader spectrum of tests in it. You have a nice balance of altitude is a challenge, of hill climbing. You might even have some cold weather to deal with early. It'll give you a little bit of technical rocky footing of 3 or 4 different types. You'll have a lot of downgrade running, as well as a lot of steep upgrade going. And so in the mix of all of that, some nice flat and fast terrain. And I think that's what makes it such a valuable measure of good horses and horsemanship, is that it's got a little sample of many different test elements in it. The Old Dominion, as much as we've tried, it's hard to get. We haven't been able to achieve as much test diversity. We've got some very technical and rocky footing, we've got some steep climbing and some rough technical going. And on top of that, the terrain tends to lend itself to being fairly technical and rigorous all the way to the end. So you might get faced with really hard work late in the day, which is mentally very tough. That one is a mental challenge. Plus, you're dealing with extreme humidity sometimes, and that really makes managing your horses critical. So I love all these courses that have multiple test elements in them and aren't just simply a matter of getting on there and doing one flat thing out. I don't mind flat courses, but I miss having the diversity of challenge in them. I think that makes them more meaningful measures of horses and a more meaningful measure of horsemanship. And the Tevis is really the king of having wonderful natural diversity in it. You know, I could say that, I was really fortunate in the people that brought me into this sport. I had some pretty exceptional mentors here, and even that first year when I'd come here with my family and our family friends, the McKay Smiths, I got to meet Wendell in 1979. I was really fortunate on the way I came into the sport and the mentors I happened to fall into. On the very first trip we came here in 1979, when I was a teenager, we had traveled out, my family with the McKay Smith family, to do this ride together. I wasn't riding that year, but I was pit crewing for my parents and the McKay Smiths, and we had a wonderful, bi-family vacation there. And I got to meet Wendell Roby and Rex Moyle and many of the other great old timers and founders of the sport. And Matthew was particularly useful. And his father, Alexander McKay Smith, was kind of one of the first people that saw what was happening here in California back in the late 50s and traveled across the country to join in and realized how significant this might be to horsemanship and as a test of horsemanship. Alexander McKay Smith had already started an organization called the American Combined Training Association for 3-day eventing, and he very much respected the concept of having our sports develop into a kind of codified system of evaluating horses for quality and natural. And he realized that it was very important that since we'd had the loss of organized breeding programs like the military programs, and we'd had the loss of organized breeding for any kind of long distance purpose that we did for commercial use and whatnot, there was no more any economic incentive, no more military incentive to breed horses for the same reason we had been using them for the past 2,000 years. It was all mostly about distance and how were they durable and could they keep it up, and suddenly with the invention of the automobile in the 1920s, as they came to the foreground, almost immediately our focus on how we bred our animals shifted, and it splintered into singular little obsessions for different little sports. And they realized even early on, people like Wendell Roby and Alexander McKay Smith realized that could spell disaster for the genetics and the genetic health of horses after a few generations if we didn't start measuring horses by a little bit more naturally rooted process. And Alexander McKay Smith in particular recognized that right on. And that's why he was out here being a part of this, in the beginning. And then his son later, Matthew McKay Smith, was one of my mentors that dragged my family out here to be a part of it. And the sport has grown ever since then, and we've grown in our knowledge with it. Yeah. I traveled out here. I came out here again in 1996 with Matthew McKay Smith. Matter of fact, in that year, I had been developing my first horse I had bred with the Moyle horse stallion, Moyle Cider, and I had bred a very nice horse, and he was just coming of age to endurance race that year. And I had planned to do the Old Dominion that year. And oddly enough, I had done several, most people don't realize nowadays, they think you have to do lots of little endurance races to develop to do the 100-miler. I didn't come up in that era, you know. I came up doing competitive trail rides. And I still feel that doing long distance, limited fixed speed events up to the same distance is just as significant or more than trying to race 50 miles and then thinking that racing 50 miles twice is the same as racing 100 miles. They're not. They're completely different objectives and contests. And you learn much more doing a 3-day measured 100-mile course and getting 100 miles done in just a few days about doing a 100-mile race than you would if you just did a bunch of short races, because they're completely different. And so I had a young horse, I called him Hybrid Vigor because he was such a crossbreed of Arab and these Moyle horses. And I prepared him with a couple of these long-distance competitive trail rides, aiming to go to the Old Dominion in the early summer that year because that was near my home. But then as I got to the last weeks of the Old Dominion, I realized that because of weather and work, I had missed a few important training sessions, and I felt like I was a couple weeks behind. So I did not start the Old Dominion with that horse. And then that year, my friend Matthew McKay Smith won the Old Dominion. And so with that, and the horse was running good, Tevis is 6 weeks later. It's just enough time to do another major event with your horse. And Matthew planned to come to the Tevis Cup and asked me if I'd like to come along with him. And I summed up, well, that's 6 weeks more. I'll be able to get, this horse will be ready in time for the Tevis. So I brought him to the Tevis for his first endurance ride. He finished 10th, and Matthew won the race that year. So we went home happy with the trailer that year. You should race 25 miles and then race 50 miles in the process of developing a horse to race 100 miles. And it's actually, they're almost irrelevant. That's like saying if you really want to start small, race the Kentucky Derby first. You know, it doesn't make it a better training ride or a lesser competition to shorten the distance. In some ways, it makes it take more skill. And it's only made people get less critical about the skill level they need before they race. They just sort of do several 50-milers, and if they survive them, they think, oh, they must be ready for doing a 100-mile race. When the concepts and the ideology you need to have to run a 100-mile competition is completely different than those shorter distances. It's a completely different thing. For a horse, running a mile to 10 miles is a sprint. And to run 30 to 60 miles is a long run. It's a nice marathon, but it's not really an ultra test, And it really is only after they get out there in the 60 to 70 mile range that you get that fabled second wind. Has to kick into gear, and you find out if they're really that type of horse, and if you've paced them properly to let that second wind come forward. And so the skill and the mindset really is completely different to do a race that's going to be more than 10 hours in the saddle and more than 7 hours in distance. And you realize when you've done it, it's actually the most native and natural thing to their athleticism. This is what their ancestors had to do to survive when the alpha mare says we're running out of grass here on this range, we're going to migrate to those mountaintops. Or when they realized that they were running out of water in this range, we're going to have to migrate over to this range in the big deserts, and cross a lot of land. Horses didn't evolve because they needed to sprint. They were already way faster than everything out there on the desert. That wasn't really the high selection part. Their selection was how well they could migrate big distances. In the early days, the endurance racing was much more a man and horse alone kind of challenge, and it's only more and more progressively over the years has all the crew support and everything else become such a big part of the picture. I mean, that wasn't really considered necessary in the beginning, and it only kind of grew in there as people realized, well, it does help give you a little edge on your time. And so more and more we've kind of learned to feel like riders feel like they're almost dependent on the crewing, but it's not such a big deal. I mean, and it's actually nice to not. I'm a bit of a minimalist when I do these things. I don't pack more than I need. I keep very simple foodstuffs for myself and for my horse, and I make an effort to not make the whole thing too complex, because I feel like, as we were talking earlier, this whole thing's about learning to be adaptive. And if you make yourself too dependent on too much complexity, you're only leaving more to go wrong. And to make the adaptiveness gets harder, not easier. And so I have very simple a few simple little things and tools and repair equipment repair items that stay and travel with me. And I make an effort to not be too dependent on too much from the outside. I enjoy some sport. Some of our rides even have, endurance rides, even have solo competitions or cavalry competitions where you sign on for a second division and promise that you will not receive assistance from anybody, and you pack your own horseshoes and everything you'll need for the day has to go on you. And I love doing those challenges. It's actually a purer way to go, and you actually enjoy it. I actually end up looking back on enjoying those more, because you never could get frustrated with anybody for not having something you expected. There was nobody else to expect anything from but yourself and your horse, and you knew you were going to deal with Mother Nature, whatever it threw you when you started out, so there aren't any surprises that day. When I've done the solo rides where I didn't have a pit crew following me, I might pack a couple of shoes, a shortened nail hammer, and a few minimal horseshoeing tools, and I would plan to just, if I needed to change shape on the shoe, I'd find a rock, and get it done. Fortunately, I've been prepared like that, and I've never really had to do it. I seldom throw a shoe on the rides, so, but you have to be prepared. The veterinary control systems, they've had to evolve and become more stringent, and most particularly they've had to sort of constantly look for leaks in the net and close little loopholes as they needed and develop. And that's really what it's largely been about. Not so much about getting tougher, but finding better techniques for making sure that there aren't any loopholes, that there aren't any horses that slip through their fingers without getting something noticed, something important noticed. And the Tevis, more than any other place, has kind of been the crucible by which all those new concepts and veterinary techniques keep getting tested. So this has been this event has been part of the evolution of the veterinary sciences as much as it's been anything else. And it's been important because as the ride got to be more popular, it started to attract more and more types of people. And not all of those people come into the sport with all of the equestrian background that maybe they should. And particularly here in America, I think some other countries like France and some places in Europe, there's such a strong foundation of equestrian, highly schooled, disciplined equestrian practice in place that they're much more critical of each other and tend to the competitors tend to be more critical of each other, in that if you aren't really well skilled and have a lot of chops behind you before you even start the ride, you get shunned off the course by your own compatriots. But here in America, we're a little more kind to each other. Sometimes that's good because it allows a little more openness and creativity of ideas. We tend to say, oh, this guy, maybe he knows something I don't, when others might say he's freaking crazy. And it puts a little more pressure on the veterinary control system to develop better and better and better control systems to make sure that if a rider doesn't have good judgment or has one weak spot in his judgment or what he's observing, that the veterinary control system will pick it up and give you the hook for it. And that's what it's about. They're just trying to make sure that no horse gets ridden a mile beyond what is sustainable and easily recovered. You know, we all want to believe that we're riding these horses in a way that after a day's rest only brings them back stronger. And that's the objective. That's what the finish and continue criteria is all about.